Wonderful. So let me quickly give a recap of what we've said so far and then bring it to where we're going in this session. Number one, man is a reflective being. You are made to mirror and to reflect. And we looked at it from a few angles, from a neurological point of view, that we've got a mirroring system by which we mirror more than just the actions or the outward appearance, but we mirror the intentions and the desires of others. We interpret the others beyond just the appearance. And so one of the most unconscious quality that is continually being suggested and forms part of this mimetic cycle is desire. Desire is being suggested to us, and we are suggesting it to others continually. And then we went into Genesis and found the original desire that gave us birth, the fact that God desired us. It means that you are not just an afterthought, but that it is the very beauty that God imagined in you that awakens his desire, that causes him to create and bring you into being. And so I want to focus on that little part of desire now, because desire, that our ability to reflect desire can cause us to be most like God or most unlike him. And this is what the Genesis 3 story takes us forward to. Now, first, let me focus again on at looking at the nature of desire in Genesis 1:26. What we see here is there are two parties, God and man. God initiates the desire by adoring man. There is no sense of rivalry here. God is not in competition with man. Neither is God afraid of a rival. Rather, God gives his own image and likeness to man. So the source of God's desire is not lack, but fullness. Now, this is going to become very important when we start looking at the desires that forms us. Because if desire has its origin in anxiety, in a sense of lack, in fear, it goes into a very different direction. But desire that has its origin in fullness, in completeness, the God who is too much, overflows, and all of this universe is the product of this overflow. Now, Genesis 2 gives us another account of creation. And it's interesting that throughout the scriptures, throughout the Pentateuch, there are two stories, two versions of every story. You know, of almost every story, two versions of the Abrahamic covenant, two creation stories, two stories in which Abraham says his wife's his sister, two stories of Esau, and two stories of just about everything. And what we don't see in the English, but what's obvious in the Hebrew, is that one story will always refer to God as Elohim, and the other story will always refer to God as Jehovah or Yahweh. And they've traced the Yahweh and the Elohim sources to two distinct regions, the northern and the southern kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And Judah would always refer to God as Yahweh, and Israel will always refer to God as Elohim. And they've got very distinct flavors. The Elohim source sees God as very elevated, very transcendent. You don't find any talking animals, any mythology, any that kind of thing in the Elohim source speaks. But the Yahweh source is much more creative in the way in which they communicate their ideas, whether it's donkeys or snakes or whatever, anything can speak. And God comes and he walks with people and he's got conversations with him. They've got different names for the holy mountain. They've got different names for Moses' parents. And whenever the Yahweh source writes, you can see that their concern is with Judah, and they are not complimentary about Israel at all. And whenever the Israel source speaks of him, they're very concerned with Israel, and they are not very complimentary about Judah at all. They're the sons of incest, they're this and whatever, and vice versa. But there came a time in which these two nations were brought together, and they were either going to be completely exterminated. In the Babylonian exile, it was very likely that they could have completely lost their identity. And it's during this time that the different traditions, the different stories are combined, and both stories are preserved. And so the second account of creation, if you read the Bible just devotionally, you won't see any contradictions. You will think, oh, this is just another kind of version of the same story. But actually, when you start reading scriptures critically, and believe me, God's not nervous of your critical reading of scriptures, when you put them next to one another, you'll find that there are some very definite contradictions. Now, in the first creation account, God first creates plants, then animals, and man is created last. In the second creation account, Genesis 2, man is created first. Then God plants a garden, puts man in the garden. Then he says, he's so alone, let's make some animals. Let him name the animals, and then man's still alone. And so God brings the division in which another important difference is created, and that's the difference between male and female. And another important difference is created in this story, and that's the difference between what produces life and what produces death. The tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this is such an important difference. And why is this story important? Because people who continually lived in anxiety and fear of evil are suddenly liberated with the thought that God is only good, and what he creates is good, and people are good. But in the midst of such good news, the question that will inevitably come up is, where does evil originate from then? If there's only one God who is good, and everything he makes is good, then what the heck is going on with all the suffering and all the trouble in this world? Where does that come from? Because it was actually much easier explaining that by just saying there's some immoral gods that's part of creation that just have fights. But when you have one God, evil becomes, the problem of evil becomes much more acute and much more definite. And so the Genesis 3 story begins to give an answer to the very nature of evil. And so in the last part of Genesis 2, we read that the man and the woman were both naked but unashamed. It's the Hebrew word arum, A-R-U-M. Then in chapter 3, the first verse, it says the snake was more arum, and we translated it there, more shrewd than any of the other animals that God created. Now, why would we translate the same word naked and shrewd? Well, Genesis 49 gives us a little bit of insight into this. When Joseph accuses his brothers of being spies, he says, you came into the land as spies to spy out the nakedness of our land. Now, what does he mean by that? He means that you've come to look at where our borders are vulnerable to penetration. So that is the idea. It's vulnerable. Obviously, when you're naked, you're more vulnerable than when you're clothed. And so the story in chapter 2 kind of ends with this thought that man and woman were naked but unashamed. Why were they not ashamed? Because they never used their nakedness to harm one another. They never used their vulnerability to harm, and so there's no shame in this nakedness. But we're now going to enter one of the first stories by which the writer wants to communicate, if God is good, if all he makes is good, then where does evil come from? Now, we have much later on associated the snake with the figure of Satan, but at the time in which this was first imagined, the snake did not represent Satan. In fact, the idea of Satan was non-existent at that stage. The snake was a symbol that was used by many of the other tribes in the area, either as a devouring evil god or as a god of fertility. It was another god, and so maybe part of the story is to say that no, even the snake is just another creature made by God. But in any case, what is so relevant about the snake is the way in which it whispers and twists, and everything within the Genesis 3 story speaks about mimetic desire. The fruit was pleasant to the eyes. It was desirable to give one power and wisdom. It was the words nakedness, the words desire, the words fruit, the word of eyes. All of these words are words that has something to do with desire. Can you see that? And somehow desire is going to be exploited within the story in such a way that it produces death rather than life. And so the snake suggests, or first asks, did God say you shouldn't eat of the fruit? And Eve answers, he said we shouldn't even touch it. So there's a bit of exaggeration which maybe betrays some sense of anxiety, some sense of the fear of prohibition, laws that promises punishment or death will always bring some kind of fear into us. And so the suggestion is made quite clearly. You will not die. God knows that in the day you eat of this fruit, you will be like him. And he doesn't want you to be like him. That's why he says you can't have the fruit. Now see what a clever twist happens. In Genesis 1, there is God and man. There's no third object of desire. It is God's desire for us that causes him to give his own image and likeness freely to us. There's no sense of inferiority. There's no sense of I need to become. There's just a sense of fullness that I reflect the one who has invested himself in me. Now in Genesis 3, a clever suggestion is made. God doesn't want you to be like him. That's why he says you can't eat this fruit. Because this, If God wants this tree more than any other tree, what happens to a reflective being that mirrors this God that we perceive to be withholding this tree from us? We want that tree more than any other tree. If God wants that tree, we want it. So what is suggested to man is this: you lack being. And here's a fruit that if you partake of this fruit, you will be like God. And suddenly there's another object brought into this mimetic cycle of desire. No longer do we just desire the God who desires us. We are now presented with an image of a God who withholds this fruit because he doesn't want us to be like him, which means we want this fruit more than anything else we want, because we want to be like him. But this is a very different kind of likeness on offer. This is a likeness that enters into rivalry with God. This is a likeness in which I can be like God without God. I can take this fruit. And so the moment mankind misconceives who God is as one who withholds rather than one who gives himself, sin becomes possible. And it's interesting that when they partake of the fruit, nothing happens. Sin is not mentioned. Death is not mentioned. Because what happens is the theological child of Adam and Eve is Cain, the first murderer. And the first sacrifice, the first murder, the first act of violence, the first time sin is mentioned, is in this act of Cain and Abel entering into rivalry of how to please God and how to properly sacrifice. So if I can again just contrast these two desires and how they work. Let me give a practical example. I must think of more examples. I get tired of my own examples. But you might not have heard this. I'll just tell you this one again. You can imagine two young boys growing up, and they become best of friends because they've got the same kind of interests. They both enjoy fishing. They both enjoy outdoor life. And they might not even be aware of the fact that their desires have reinforced one another's desires. They might think, I'm just lucky to have a friend that's so much like me, not recognizing that I have adopted so much of their desires and they have reflected so much of my desires, and that's the way it's supposed to work. We are reflective beings because that is what makes friendship possible. That we can connect and reflect one another's desires and participate in one another's interests and intertwine ourselves with one another's lives. That reflective nature is good. This is what makes friendship possible. But you can imagine how these two boys grow up, and maybe in college they suddenly notice the same girl. And even the noticing that my friend notices the same girl just intensifies the desire. And so suddenly, the fact that desire is mimetic means that competition and rivalry is birthed out of the very quality that made friendship possible. And so a third object of desire, if the competition is not stopped. And competition, again, competition on its own is not bad. Some of the most successful companies compete without getting overwhelmed with the competition. The companies that becomes obsessed with the competition are normally the ones who fail. But the nature of desire is that it stirs desire, and it stirs competition, and it stirs rivalry. And if rivalry is not stopped, it can end in violence. And so the very quality, our reflective nature, with which we are able to reflect the nature, the character, and the desires of God, can become the very quality that becomes twisted. When does it become twisted? When instead of seeing the fullness of the one who desires us, we allow a sense of lack to suggest that if you can only have this, you will be complete. I mean, if you can only get that job, you'll be happy. If you can only own that car, you will be fulfilled. You see, at the heart of that desire for the fruit is not really the desire for the fruit. It's a sense of lack of being. And when we live out of a sense of lack of being, then we chase after every object in the hope that this will satisfy, this relationship will satisfy, this object will satisfy, this activity will satisfy. It will never satisfy until you come face to face with the God who is satisfied with you. And you reflect the desire that imagined you. And you realize that, oh man, I must maybe just share this with you, but I haven't shared this for years. My goodness, this happened, was it 20 years ago? 20 or so years ago, I had a computer business in South Africa, and it's the first kind of business I owned, and I was a bit stupid. The one day, somebody ordered an outfit for all their offices. I ordered all the computers. They gave me a post-dated check, and it bounced. And for a small company, this was the biggest outlay we've had ever. But, you know, it was such a lucrative deal. And so it bounced, and the equipment and everything, the company disappeared with the equipment. And here suddenly we are, and I had my office in our house. And so we went through a few weeks through the court system. But in any case, we came to a place where everything we owned is going to be repossessed. And I remember arriving back at home the one day, and we stopped at the top of we had a driveway going down to the house, and the kids were young. They were 5 and 7, I think. And Eugene said, "The burglars are here." But it was the sheriff. And they had trucks, and they've loaded up everything we own, and they were just about to leave. And so, as they left and we walked into the house, I mean, they took everything that was of value. I think it was clothing and beds that they left, and there was a few pieces of scattered paper, but there's nothing in this house. And they walk into that, and if ever there's a time where you can feel a sense of lack, this is not just all my stuff is gone. What the enemy suggests is your reputation is gone. You are gone. I mean, you've got nothing. You've failed your family. You failed. And I don't know, I stood there kind of overwhelmed with, there's just nothing in the house. And so everybody kind of disappeared to their rooms because that's the only place you could still sit on a bed. I don't know what possessed Mary Ann, but she came to me and gave me a hug and said, I believe in you. And with that, I kind of walked into what was still an office, and there was a little plastic chair at the desk, and I went and sat this plastic chair, and they left the Bible there. They probably thought they can't sell that. And that was kind of lying on this next to me, and I suddenly, in the midst of all these suggestions of worthlessness and lack of being, I suddenly heard another voice. Another voice that said, no one can take your joy without your permission. And I thought, but no, they've taken all our furniture, the TV. Surely you can't have joy without the TV and furniture. They've taken, everything we have. Look at this. And as this thought was welling up in me, I just flipped the Bible open. And it was Hebrews, 10:38, that says, they received with joy the possession of their goods, knowing that they have within them an everlasting source of joy. Oh, I burst out laughing and crying and shouting at the same time. And in that situation of contrast, I suddenly became aware to what extent we've been deceived to think our joy is contained in stuff. And for me, it took the very real situation of having no stuff and remaining conscious of this joy, this treasure that no one can take. The sense of being. That means the only thing I desire is the one who desires me. The only thing I want to awaken in others is to let you know that you are more complete than what you've ever imagined. You've got a treasure within you that God so wants to awaken by bringing you face to face again with the true light that enlightens every man. That wants to awaken your sense of completeness. Because this God, who created you in his likeness and image, thinks you are just amazing. Ooh, Papa. And so desire can become such a powerful, beautiful force. There's nothing wrong with desire, but consider, who are you allowing to awaken your desires? What are you allowing to influence your desires? Jesus was very much aware of the fact that we are reflective beings, and that's why he purposely looked beyond just his culture. And he says, I do not do anything unless I see my Father doing it. I don't say anything unless I see my Father, unless I hear my Father saying it. I do not desire. Can you see that? I do not desire to do my own will, but I mimic the intention, the desire of the one who sent me. In John 1 verse 18, Jesus says, no one has ever seen the Father. You see, this is the real problem. The real problem is not the stealing, the killing. Those are kind of results. That's the outflow, that is the implications of having wrong desires. That's why James, I think it's chapter 4, chapter 5, the first few verses says, where does conflict and war and violence come from? It's because of your perverted desires. You desire, but you're never satisfied. He wants to bring us back to that place where we see the true God again. This true God that no one has seen. Jesus comes to be a visible model of what this God is like. And what is he like? He's the kind of God that gives himself. Isn't that what Jesus does? He identifies with our weakness. He identifies with the victims. He doesn't, Philippians 2 is the total inverse of Genesis 3. In Genesis 3, man, lacking being in our nervousness, our anxiety and fear, grasp after the image and likeness of God, try and attain it through our own effort. Isn't that what we still do in all religions? Just try and become more like Jesus, more like God. But Jesus comes and he says he did not consider equality with God as something to be grasped after. But he just lays aside all divine privileges and gives himself. And if you didn't hear this morning's message, I would encourage you to go and get that on the website, where the lawyer asked, what is the secret to getting onto the inside of the life of God? And Jesus' answer is so amazing. You're going to find opportunities in the chaos of this life to identify with victims and to give yourself beyond your comfort. And it's when you discover the joy of giving yourself freely that you're going to discover what it means to be the image and likeness of God. You haven't lived until you've given yourself away. That is why love is such a risk. But it's the only thing that makes life worth living. Because in loving someone else, you do give yourself. It's almost an act of dying. You give yourself away. Love is not preserving or protecting yourself. Love is making yourself vulnerable. And what we often do, like Adam and Eve, is we want to make our protective clothing because we don't want to be hurt again. And you can live within your cocoon, but there's also no intimacy when all your clothes are on. There's no intimacy when we're just busy protecting ourselves. We've got to become vulnerable. Risk being hurt to enjoy the bliss of being loved. Ooh, Papa. Mary Ann, do you want to get ready with a song or two? Wow. There are, I don't often do this because I just embarrass her, but there are not many girls who could live the life she lives, just out of a suitcase from one place to the other. I'm so grateful for her. So desire. God desires you. Woo! And you are made as a reflective being to reflect back that desire. You are not the originator of your own desires, but desire forms you. So for you to get closer to an answer of who am I, ask yourself this question: what do I desire? And then secondly, where does this desire come from? Ultimately, we are made to love. Now, if I have to kind of summarize my desire, or the best desire that anyone can have, it's this desire. I desire to love and to be loved. But the form that desire takes can be so varied. No, we determine that the best way in which we can love is to stir up others with the understanding that we've gained, with the books, the resources, and so it takes that form. So work out in your life. The details might be different, but I can tell you this, that if the conclusion to your desire is, I want to love, you are going to live such a fulfilled life. Because in loving, you will be loved. That's just the way in which our reflective nature works. It doesn't start with, I want to be loved. We know we are loved by our Maker. We reflect Him. We are loved already. How do we express this love to others? Thank you. Thank you, Miriam.